All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our study of the Gospel of Mark. We're in our 13th and final lesson, finishing the Gospel of Mark today. We'll cover the rest of the book. We'll cover the longer ending. We'll talk about what that means. And then we'll have some time for discussion about what's spoken to you out of the book of Mark, over the whole course of the time. What struck you? What was new? What was meaningful to you. So I'm going to be thinking about that, what that meant to you. We'll talk about that at the end. So we ended last week on the death of Jesus on the cross with these various people looking on, right? The women who had followed him and ministered to him this whole time right there, and the centurion who maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, proclaim the final truth about Jesus' death, that how he died showed the reality of his nature as the Son of God. So let's, from there, we're going to begin by reading Mark 15, 42 through 47, Jesus's burial. Will someone read that out loud?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so when is this happening?
Not quite nightfall on Friday, like Friday afternoon.
Right. So this is, when does the Sabbath start?
Sundown.
Sundown on Friday through, sundown on Saturday. The days are offset from where we would consider the days, right? So preparation day is the day that the Jews would do what?
Well, they do all the cooking and all the stuff that they couldn't do on the Sabbath.
Yeah, all the work that it requires to live and eat during the day on the Sabbath, they would do on preparation day. And so, it was late in the afternoon when Jesus died. And so they're up against a little deadline here, right? Because the work of the body would not be conducted on the Sabbath. And so they're have this small amount of time left on Friday to do the work of getting Jesus to a burial, right? Who comes and asks for the body? What happens?
One of the Sanhedrin.
Yeah, it says a counselor. It doesn't use the word for Sanhedrin, but that's exactly what we think. It calls him a council member. It's a single word, a counselor. And so probably a member of Sanhedrin. What else do we know about him?
He was looking for the kingdom of God.
Yeah, looking for, waiting for, anticipating would be that word. He's anticipating the kingdom of God. What does that mean?
That means he knows who Jesus is.
Maybe, right? Judging by the fact that he comes and asks for Jesus's body, yeah, right? Mm-hmm. But this could be used to describe any devout Jew in this time period. The kingdom of God is like the messianic age, the time of God's rule, God taking the current age into the age to come would be the way that a Jewish person would think about it. And so if you're looking for God to do the next thing, that's an indication that he's a devout Jew. That he's looking for God to send the Messiah or bring in the next age. Yeah. What else do we learn about him?
That he wasn't afraid to step out of what the group was doing.
Right? What phrase do you have for his going? How did he go to Pilate?
Boldly.
Boldly? Anything different?
Mine says took courage.
Yeah, mine says gathered up his courage. Yeah, he went boldly. Why would it require courage? Amy, you touched on this.
Well, they're the ones that kind of sentenced him to death. But if he's not a believer and he's looking forward to the kingdom of God, he also wants to do the right thing, even if he doesn't believe who Jesus is.
Right. So there's some possibilities here, right? And you've touched on a bunch of them. That's great. So for one thing, he's a counselor, probably of the Sanhedrin, right? And the Sanhedrin is the one Jesus was, the first trial was before the Sanhedrin. So he's stepping out of the party line, right? He's going against the group that sent Jesus to his death in order to come and bury him. That's part of it. Also, in terms of Rome, what was Jesus executed for?
Inciting a riot.
Okay, so this would be in the category, you started to say it, treason, right? Rome didn't let you bury the people they executed for treason. They put them on a cross on purpose so that they would be tortured and humiliated publicly, and then their bodies would be left as an example, an object lesson of what happens when you divide Rome. You didn't get to take them down and bury them. So it took special permission of the Roman magistrate to allow a burial, and public mourning was forbidden. And so Joseph has to take courage to go ask Pilate for the body, right? However, Amy talks about, like, why would he do that? Because he's a devout Jew. Listen to this from Deuteronomy 21, 22 and 23. This is so from the Jewish law. This is how they would think about a burial. If a man has committed a sin worthy of death and he is put to death, and you hang him on his tree, not crucifixion in the original law, and yet we see, that element of hung on a tree show up in the crucifixion, right? His corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day. For he who is hanged is accursed of God, so that you do not defile your land, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. So Jewish faith and custom required that even criminals were given burials, and it should be even the same day of the death. And to fail to observe this custom was to defile the land. And when the Jews were, when you read the story of the Exodus and the Jews coming into the promised land, they are told that the reason the people that were living there before them are getting defeated and pushed out of the land is because their worship practices included this long list of abusive and like terrible practices that were so bad, everything from sexual practices with minors, stuff, to child sacrifice. It goes through the whole ugly list. And then it says, this behavior defiled the land, and the land is vomiting them out, and I'm giving you the land as an inheritance. And don't you do the things they did, or the land will, you'll defy the land, and the land will vomit you out too. And then when we get to the point of the exile, this is the long history of the Jews in their promised land. When we get to the point of the exile, they're told, you did the things, you got so bad, you did all these terrible things up to and including sacrificing their children to the idols, that you've defiled the land. And so this would be a thing that a devout Jew would take very seriously, right? This is the kind of thing that really matters to them. And so we see an element of devout Jewishness in Joseph of Arimathea, that even a criminal, even an enemy, you would want to bury. But we also see, whose job was it to maybe bury someone? Who would you expect to show up to get the body?
Family.
Yeah, a close male relative would be the person who would be in charge of this. Who, in Jesus's case, who else might you expect?
The disciples.
Yeah, right? Right?
And also like all of the rituals involving being clean and unclean, there's parts of the Old Testament that specifically say like, you know,
Gretchen, I didn't catch that, and now your video is frozen and the audio was corrupt. Could anyone else hear that?
oh,
We missed it.
would you
Try
be
one more
unclean
time.
for? Okay.
What's that? Oh, no, don't have it. So I heard rituals involving cleanliness, and yes, handling a dead body would be something you would be unclean from, and then you would have to be cleansed, for the preparation. What does it say to us that the disciples don't go get the body?
They were still scared.
Yeah, they weren't there. They had abandoned him. Jesus is not taken care of in death by his followers or his family. And maybe they were still afraid of the authorities, right? It would be risky. It says it took courage. And so maybe someone associated with him is scared to go ask for his body. But Joseph goes boldly. And what else does he do? Verse 46. He
Buys the linen shroud and he actually buries him.
Yeah, he provides this linen cloth himself. This is probably an indication that he is wealthy. He buys this linen cloth. It's the same word as the young man who was wearing a linen cloth, and who they grabbed the linen cloth and he fled, and leaving the cloth in their hand, and fled naked. There's like maybe a little symbolism there, like this young man is dressed for death and flees, and Jesus dies in his place. This linen cloth is burial clothes, right? And so Joseph provides the burial clothes, and he places it in a tomb cut out of rock. What would this be like?
Little cave.
Yeah, like a cave. They would be like carved out of the hillside, a site. It would be designed for an entire family, right? Like this is a little foreign to us because we don't put, we might have burial plots side by side, but once we have a grave, we don't like reuse it, right? It's used, it's full. But what they would do is that a body would be laid in a cave with spices and wraps. And after decay, the bones are collected. They're placed in a box called an ossuary. I think I'm saying that right. I hope so. I didn't re-look it up and make sure. Is that right? Good. And the cave would be used for a number of bodies. And so Joseph has this tomb available, but it's never been used, right? Maybe another indication that he's wealthy. Today, the Mount of Olives, I got to go to Israel several years ago, and I was expecting the Mount of Olives to be covered with olive trees. Wouldn't y'all think? Shouldn't it be covered with olive trees? It should be garden-ish. It's completely brown and completely covered with ossuaries. It's boxes. People who want to be buried as close to the Temple Mount as possible. And so those, that idea of like this tomb would be reused, but it never has been used. What else do we see? Who else is there?
Pilate.
Well, so Pilate, so he has to do why is he surprised?
Because he didn't expect him to be dead yet.
Yeah, this is a crucifixion is a long drawn out death. He's like, isn't he still being tortured out there? And so we get this, he learns from the centurion, maybe the centurion that made the exclamation upon Jesus's death that we saw yesterday. Maybe a different. So he gives permission, and then verse 47, who else is there?
Mary.
Yeah, these women. Why does Mark tell us that the women were there?
Well, because they had been following him. I mean, they were at the crucifixion where the disciples weren't, and they're wanting to see what happens. They don't want the Romans to get a hold of him.
Yeah, aren't they? They are. He shows us how devoted these women were. We see several points where Mark is quite keen to mention the people who showed devotion to Jesus and how it mattered. Yeah, that's one reason. What's another?
Were they there to prepare the body?
Probably. This would take pounds of spices, many pounds of spices to prepare the body. They are short on time. Later, they arrive with spices, so it may be that they didn't have time to finish. But yes, the work of preparing a body is involved, and so it may have taken several people. And Joseph of Arimathea probably had servants helping him carry.
And I wonder if the women kind of brought Joseph to have someone with some credibility to go be on their behalf. Like they weren't quite sure if they needed some backup.
They needed a man.
They needed the clout.
Someone who was from there, someone with some money, someone with some who could say, well, this is the plan if they were asked.
I think you make a great point. I've never thought of it that way. But we do, all of Jesus's people are not residents of Jerusalem, right? These are all people who are there as pilgrims. They're not in their home base, right? And so they don't have connections. Joseph obviously did. He's prominent and he's a counselor, right? So he obviously has connections. I don't know, we would have to just completely speculate to say that they asked him for help, but it's an interesting idea. One more thing, it doesn't just say it was there. It doesn't just say they were there. It says they saw what?
Where he was buried.
Where he was laid.
Where he was laid. And so when someone says, well, you just don't know which tomb was his, what do we say?
We had an eyewitness.
We have eyewitnesses. You notice he mentions two names, the testimony of two witnesses, right? The ancient writers they often give us details that we can say like, oh, eyewitnesses testify to this, right? And so two witnesses at least, and it mentions more women earlier, so maybe more, saw where he was laid. And so we're not going to say that we don't know which tomb was his, because Joseph laid him in his tomb and the women saw where he was laid, right? Witnesses. Yeah. Let's read 16, 1 through 8, please.
When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
Thank you. Okay, so the first, so why do these women show up? What are they doing?
They're trying to finish the job of preparing the body.
Yeah. So are they expecting the resurrection?
No.
Why they
You
wouldn't
don't
have,
bring spices to a resurrection.
right? Yeah.
You bring Nutella.
Celebration
chocolate.
chocolates. Yes.
Yeah.
And now we've arrived at Easter tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they don't need spices. They wouldn't bring spices, and they're worried about the stone. Now, why are they worried about the stone?
Because it was big, and they'd rolled it in front of it, and they'd sealed it, and there were guards and everything else, and they didn't know how they were going to deal with all that. It's not like you could get the guards to move the stone. I mean, they're not going to do this. So
Yeah.
they don't have much of a plan.
They're just doing the best they can, right?
Yeah.
We've been there. They're like, I don't know.
We'll work
cross
it
that
out on the
bridge.
way. We'll figure it out. We'll work
And
it out when we
sometimes
get there.
it's
This
easier to worry
stone-
about logistics than to worry about like bigger ideas.
Mhm. Yeah. Your grief. Yeah. They had to have been struggling with their grief and maybe retreating into the logistics, which is what we sometimes need to do, right? The stone, the purpose was to keep out animals and intruders. So it was in like a channel. So the channel went downhill to cover the entrance. So it was easy to roll into place, but difficult to roll out of place. And so even though between Joseph and the women that were there, they rolled the stone against the entrance of the tomb, they're concerned how we going to roll it away, and it will require several strong people. This large stone is another indication that the tomb is big enough that this was a wealthy man's tomb, right? And we have that little thread of echo again. Isaiah 53:9 says, "His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth." So we have this little like story of the wealth of the person who comes to put Jesus in his tomb. Yeah. So they show up, and what do they find? The women with the spices, they show up. What do they find?
Stone
An
is
angel.
rolled away, and there's a man sitting where Jesus should be in the tomb.
Yeah, so it says young man, right? And yet we know this is to be you said it, Terry, what would you say?
An angel.
Right, because he's got the white robe and they're so alarmed, right? This is what, when you meet an angel, people are always terrified. This happens over and over in scripture. You know, the first words of the angel are always fear not, right? And what are his first words?
Don't be alarmed.
Yeah, don't be alarmed, right? So he's comforting them. He says, "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene." And what is his pronouncement?
He has risen.
He is risen. So this is like the culminating good news of the Gospel of Mark, said by this angel. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go. Who are they supposed to tell?
The disciples, but then Peter gets a shout out, like a separate.
Right. Why does
mention.
Peter get a shout out?
Because he was extra naughty.
he's had a bad couple days.
Confident boasting and
Outside of
subsequent
direction.
denials.
Yeah. I think, in other Gospels, we get a story of the restoration of Peter. I find it so curious that story is not told in the Gospel that probably comes from Peter's testimony, right? And yet we see a little sense of a little hint towards Peter's restoration here. Go tell the disciples, and especially although he is one of the disciples, we mention Peter, right? We want, and then what is the word? Where's Jesus going?
Galilee.
To Galilee, which is exactly what Jesus said. You remember at the close of the Last Supper, they sing a hymn and they go out, and Jesus is talking about how they're all going to fall away. This is in chapter 14, verse 27. And Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because it is written, I will strike down the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." So we're seeing this completion, right? The angel is saying the very thing. Jesus has gone to the very place Jesus told you beforehand that he would go. He would go ahead of you into Galilee. Jesus' words are still coming true. And although the sheep have been scattered, he goes ahead of you, meaning you come to me at Galilee. There's a sense of the reunion is about to happen, right? So we're going to talk about verse 8 in a minute, but before we do that, let's just kind of think about the resurrection, right? So when we talk about the cross, what does the cross mean? And we touched on this last week. What is the theological, I guess we could say, meaning of the cross?
Sacrifice.
A sacrifice. Yeah, he could not save others. He saved others, but he cannot save himself, right? Sacrifice. Jesus said, "The Son of Man has come to give his life as a ransom for many." And so there's that idea that was in the third prediction of the Passion in chapter 10. So there's this idea of, the ransom is paid with Jesus's death. And then with that expression of the centurion we talked about, this is who God is. He's the God who suffers. Messiahship goes along with sacrifice, goes along with suffering and giving himself completely, right? So that's the meaning of the cross. So then what's the meaning of the resurrection?
Just power and victory.
Yeah, it's a victory, right? Yeah. Jesus has power over sin and death. So if the cross is the ransom, the resurrection shows his victory. He's now ready to reign at the right hand of the Father. Remember, he said, you will see the Son of Man coming in power, coming with the clouds, and he's seated at the right hand of the power and coming in the clouds. The victory is won. Yeah, what else? The story doesn't end with death, right? What comes after death?
Resurrection and getting to be with God.
Life, joining God, right? Jesus is the firstborn from among the dead. I think that's 1 Corinthians 15, like this idea that if Jesus has gone from death to life, then it shows his power can bring us from death to life, right? The resurrection matters. It's, it's the completion of the crucifixion, because we don't end in death either. We get to follow in Jesus's way of entering into new life with God, right?
And just like he's gone on ahead to Galilee and will catch up, it has that same echo.
Yeah. And it leads to, so it's like we follow in, the resurrection kind of life. And then also we have our instructions, right? We have our instructions to live like people who follow a resurrected Lord. We tell the disciples, and especially Peter, will be this first step in telling the gospel to the world, right? And we see that as the story continues in Acts. So there's all, you know, this is told in fairly spare language, isn't it? You know, we have less detail than we get in some of the other gospels, and yet you see the meaning is woven in here. Any other comments on these or questions? Or
You know, doesn't it seem like for like the whole point of the Bible, like it's such a little sentence. He's risen, he's not here.
Mhm.
It's like, I mean, like it's so little and so huge.
it is, yeah. Well, and how do we read it? You know, what tone do we read it in? Maybe that matters. But yeah, he is risen is
I
the
don't have an
picture.
exclamation point. Mine's just a period.
Yep.
You know, that angel was excited to get that job of sitting there waiting on those ladies.
Mhm.
I like that. I think you're probably right. I think that had to have been a good job.
You got
I
to
mean,
see his tomb, didn't you?
what's that, Vicki?
In Israel, you got to see what they think is Jesus' tomb.
Well, kind of. I went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but there was a really, really long line to look in what was basically like a little window into a little square of rock. I didn't stand in the line to look in the window to the square of rock,
Got it.
even though I was in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's interesting that it was quite a strange experience because that church is sort of divided into little sections that are controlled by different groups. Like this is the Gregorian monks section, and this is the, like, it's I don't know if that's a beautiful thing that they all come together around Jesus, or if it was like a little sectarian. I couldn't decide how I felt about it. And because there are multiple groups doing multiple things, the amount of incense is like, it's just hanging heavy in the air, and that like it smells are sometimes kind of hard for me, and that was a little like overwhelming. And then when you first walk in, there is, you know, this idea that Joseph took him down from the cross. There's this stone, this flat stone that was said to be, and you know, all these items all were like found like in the 300s. So I don't think there's quite enough continuity to know that we have the actual items, but they're considered holy, you know, respect that, but I don't like. So anyway, the stone is there, and there were like people just thronged around it, and they were pouring oil on it, and then they would have these beautiful scarves, and then they're just sopping up the oil with their scarves while they're weeping the entire time. So it's down at 4 levels, so they're like on their knees and on their faces, bent over, and just weeping and mopping up the oil with their scarves, so that the scarf would be holy with the oil from the stone on which Jesus's body was laid as he was taken down from the cross. So it was, I was unprepared for the scene. It was quite striking and unfamiliar. There were all people of all languages. It's packed. There's lines to see every little thing. And then there's like Gregorian monks coming through, like swinging the incense and like chanting, and then they have to get out of the way so that the Armenians can go. And it was just, it's quite a scene. I got way off track there. That was not in the lesson
Alright.
plan.
So also, I've always been interested in the Shroud of Turin because it, you know, they think that maybe was on Jesus, but
All four Gospels mention this linen shroud. It's interesting. It's in all of them, even in Mark, where we don't get as much detail. Yeah. So I think, this, this very spare telling, this one little line of "He is risen," it's a shocker that it has developed into what it is now. So let's talk about that. Kind of leads us into, let's look at what might be the last line in the original Gospel of Mark. Verse 8, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. How's that for an ending? That's kind of a strange ending, isn't it? The Mark is thought to be written late first century, probably just after 70 AD. The earliest manuscripts don't have the rest of the verses. So starting in verse 9, the earliest manuscripts don't have those. Those appear in late second century manuscripts. And it's pretty universally agreed by scholars that those verses 9 and following were not part of the original. So there's some possibilities here. One is that we're wrong and they are part of the original and we just don't have the right earliest manuscripts. That could be true, but it's not thought to be likely. Things change though. This is what, scholars do. They keep researching. It's just like science, right? You keep researching and you find new things. It could be that Mark had an original ending, which has been lost, which would be so sad. I don't want anything lost, right? But it could have been that there was an original ending, and because it was lost, it was replaced as best as possible with a later summary from other witnesses, and that's how we get, this 9 and following. Or it could be that Mark originally ended with 16:8, and that it's the true ending of the book, and that later, scribes added this helpful ending because it seemed abrupt to them. How does it seem to you?
That would be a terrible way to end things.
I used to agree, and I've changed my mind. So I don't know. There's no right or wrong answer to whether you think that this is a good, you're okay to think that. And I have thought that. I don't think that now though, but so let's talk about it. Why would it be a terrible way to end?
Well, because they're not telling anybody and they're afraid. I mean, and clearly that's not where things were left, because they told people because we have this. So
right. Yeah.
It
Clearly
doesn't feel good, and I need it to feel good.
I want happy endings. All happy endings required. Yes, I do feel
Very
that way in all my fiction
cliffhangery. Yes, it's very cliffhanger for a reader. It's very much a cliffhanger, because you're like, he said, go ahead. He will be ahead of you in Galilee, and you'll see them there. And then they just left. Like, what? Wait a second. You said you would go ahead, but now they're trembling and afraid. Like, you want the rest.
Okay.
Clearly, this was not designed by Hallmark.
Okay. Yeah.
It reminds me of the end of the Dark Tower series by Stephen King, where I've made it through 7 books that I read over a series of 25 years. And I finally get to the end and it's like, I read all this and I followed all this for that.
Yeah.
That's why I can't keep reading Paige. That's why I can't keep reading Outlander. I got to a happy place and I can't leave my happy place.
Can't take it anymore. Yep.
I want to believe this is how things ended for Jamie and Quinn.
Yeah. Book 3, I'm good. Yeah.
Erin, what were you going to say?
I think it's a great ending, because it's like the whole time it's like, don't tell anybody, and no one could keep their mouth shut. They all babbled and blabbed it, and then now they're like, go and tell them, and they're like, oh no. Oh no.
But wait, remember all those times you told us to not tell anybody? Now we're gonna listen to you.
But clearly it got told, and it got out. So something more than their fear happened.
Okay.
But I just
So-
love that it ended with like, oh my gosh, this is a secret. We're not telling anybody, and yet it's everywhere.
But this
Yeah.
is the time where it stops being Jesus' story. And it becomes the story of the disciples. So if there's a writing that comes after this, you have told the story of the life of Christ. And while we'd probably like to end with the Ascension or Pentecost or one of those things, this is the end of that story. It's the beginning of the story of Christians and the church and what comes next. And that's a different story.
Interesting point. Yeah.
I love that thought. The one thing that catches me in this, and it's not to say that that's not correct, because I think that's perfectly said. The whole book, you get people that don't get it, they don't get it, they don't get it. They still don't get it.
They still don't get it. Yeah. Yeah. So take that. So let's build on that. So who are the original readers of this gospel? I said it was written, like probably maybe 70 around before or after, probably after end of Peter's life, as Mark has been listening to him for years and he's writing down this testimony. Who's reading it?
The early church, just like early Christians, Gentiles, or would it be?
Yeah, Jews, Gentiles,
Yeah,
early
Jews, Gentiles.
church. Yeah, by this time, very much spread to Gentiles. What do they know about Peter? What do they know about Mark? What do they know about all the apostles?
That they didn't stay afraid.
Didn't stay afraid. What a great way to say it. Yeah, these apostles are the very ones that have been themselves dying for their faith, right? Peter was probably martyred. I have this written down. Do I have it? Mid-60s, probably, in Rome. Probably right. It takes time to develop a manuscript. It's all handwritten, scrolls. Scribes are helping you. You're having them do the editing, like copies to go out. Like as people are reading this, they are reading it in the context of living through the martyrdom of these very apostles and the wildfire spread of the church, right? So that, in the very city where Peter is martyred, just before that, there's Christianity is spreading so much in Rome that they're like, we have to shut this down, expel all the Christians. We can't, like it's becoming a force in the ancient world, that Christianity as it continues. And so I think, if the gospel were to end here, then we have to see that in light of the reality of how the disciples have changed, right? And who changes people like that? People are not good at changing, are they? We only change through the power of God. And so as they are looking at this massive turnabout in the boldness, understanding, conception of the apostles, and the spread of the gospel, it's one more way to see, surely this man was the Son of God, right? Like it's its own testimony. And then I think the other thing is, the way the crucifixion scene is written in Mark, right? If we're not thinking about dramatic irony as we're going through it, it's just a sad story, right? But if we're thinking about dramatic irony as we go through it, or if we're reading it with the understanding of a believer, then what do we see over and over as we look through, as we read through the crucifixion scene, right? the high priest pronounces, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus's testimony is the only true testimony, and it's the testimony on which he goes to the cross. The robe, the purple robe, he deserves the purple robe. He deserves the real crown. He deserves the hail and the bowing down of all of these, you know, the nations, right? Those are Gentiles that do that. The nations bow down to him as they do to the Son of Man who's given dominion over the nations. The nations in the form of the centurion are exclaiming, "Surely this man is the Son of God." And so if we read it with a view to who Jesus really is, the whole crucifixion scene is pointing to victory, victory, victory. And so the very thing that Mark has woven in has been said, right? He hasn't left it unsaid, even though he didn't preach it to us, right? He showed, not told, right? The old writing idea, right? And so it's all in there. We just have to believe to see it. Yeah. Well, let's read the longer ending, and then we'll talk about what y'all felt like you got out of Mark this time around. Someone read 9 through the end of the book for us.
I will.
Thanks.
When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. He said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people and they will get well." After the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up to heaven and he sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by the signs that accompanied it.
Okay, thoughts on this section?
Maybe they just wanted to legitimize Paul.
He's the one who picked up the snake, right?
Yeah.
I thought about that as we were reading it. I was like, who's picking up snakes? Oh yeah, Paul.
It really feels like they need to put a bow on it.
Yeah.
It does feel
and
rushed.
This is old material. Like, this is 2nd century. This is super old, right? This is the testimony of the very early church. So even if it isn't original to the Gospel of Mark, I think there's value in it, in that it's the testimony of believers. It's kind of a summary. It doesn't read like the rest of Mark, right? Where were the sandwiches? Were there any sandwiches? It can't be, right? Like, we would expect some sandwiches in here.
And no one was in a hurry. I mean, they
no
were in a
one
hurry, but they
immediately-
weren't in a hurry. Yeah.
Right. There were no crowds. I don't know. You know, I think it feels like a completing summary, and I think that's okay, right? There don't seem to be a lot of Old Testament allusions running through here. How could Mark possibly write without Old Testament allusions? He could.
There's no sandwich.
Right? No sandwich, can't be. So, but this is okay, because what we have here is the testimony of the early church, which we also care about. And so I think that's why our translators go ahead and put it in. And we like to have the bow. And all of these events are events that are attested in the other Gospels, right? We have some legitimate content here that fits with the other Gospels, represents the early church. And so that's how I think, I used to get a little stressed, like, was the original Mark a sad story? And then is this real? Does this count? Is it inspired? You know, but I think, you know, the original Mark is a triumphant story with that striking contrast between the understanding as they lived it and the understanding as they lived on in the church.
This is like the jump. This is like when you watch a Marvel movie and you're past the credits and they have that little snippet at the end that's the jumping point for the next
The
story.
end credits. Yeah.
And aren't we glad we have the book of Acts, right? Because we want to know the rest of the story. And so I'm so thrilled we have Luke continues into Acts, that we can get, the story of the early church and what some of those things mean. Yeah.
And perhaps when Mark was writing this, he knew the church knew the rest of the story. So
Yeah.
he's knowing what happened, and they knew, because that's where they started in.
Great point. Great point. Because he points to the church all the way through, right? Every time Jesus predicts his death, he goes straight into just teaching his discipleship, right? Like Jesus is pointing towards the church. I used to think, like, why doesn't Jesus ever talk about, like, if the church is so important, why doesn't Jesus ever mention it? But he really does teach toward the community of faith, doesn't he?
This is also like the first of any of those stories written, and it literally is, this is Jesus, the Son of God. Here's our base. It's not about the church. It's about the center of their belief.
Yeah. And Amy said something before we started class about, like, I guess if God wanted it that way, then I guess it must, if God didn't want this to be this way, he would have made it a different way. We were talking about Mark being technically anonymous, that like the name is not, the author is not actually in the book. But I think it applies here too, right? Like, God gave us this, and then he gave us 3 more gospels, and we get, and that's part of the reason we don't know, but it emotionally makes sense to me that Mark was first, because I feel like the other gospels were like, let me give you some more, and you want more Jesus? Let me tell you more about other stuff, more about what they had. So yeah. The other gospels elaborate on this, and they really fill out some of this later detail, the post-resurrection appearances. And some of the earliest written down material in the New Testament is like a list of Jesus's post-resurrection appearances. And Paul kind of quotes it in 1 Corinthians, where he says, I passed on to you what I received, that Jesus, and he kind of gives the gospel story, and it ends in these eyewitnesses to his post-resurrection appearances. That's probably some of the earliest written down material we have on the gospel. And so we know that the early church was very keen to preserve that. And they were probably actively preserving it as Mark was being written. Yeah, great point. Well, what has struck you out of the book of Mark? What's resonated? What have you liked? What do you want to study more?
I keep going back to the end of the temple age and the beginning of, having a Messiah, and a living Messiah. And that he said that right next to the, Temple Mount, and it was just sort of, that's gone. And now we're here. So
Yeah.
never thought of it that way before.
It's striking. And, we get this, even in the longer ending, it's like, then he sat down at the right hand of God, right? Like this. And so this idea, like, that the connection between heaven and earth is now the exalted Jesus to the Spirit-led followers, right? That's how heaven meets earth. Yeah. Anything still bothering you about Mark?
And I think part of this is the way we tend to approach children's Sunday school. And I've spent more of my time in children's Sunday school than adult Sunday school, since I always end up teaching it. But we look at stories and we pull stories that we can connect to easily and not necessarily view the Gospels as four separate documents with four separate writers and times and motivations and audiences. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Amy Jo Levine, but she's a Jew, but she is a New Testament scholar. And I've been reading a lot of her writing, and she has great podcasts and stuff on YouTube. And when I read and I hear her stuff, I really see Jesus as a Jew in a Jewish context. And
It's
it's a
hard for us
different
to do, right?
Right. She has a book, The Bible With and Without Jesus, in which she looks at scriptures in the mostly the Old Testament, but going into the New, and like, this is how a Jewish person views this. When you don't think that everything is fulfilled, that prophecy is fulfilled, this is how you would read this. When you do, this is how you would read this. And one of the things she talks about in her book about the passion narrative is the distinction of each of the four gospels. And so this Mark doesn't get pulled from as much as some of the other gospels, and I've really not had a feel for Mark specifically, other than as I'm reading John, I look at Mark and go, oh, well, here's more details about this. Or as I'm reading Matthew, so it's been interesting now having kind of a more overview literary understanding of the Bible to dig through this gospel and see it as a narrative with a purpose and a history with a specific audience, rather than just, oh, I want to talk about this story. Here's the two gospel. Okay, we'll go with the Mark version. So that's been really interesting. It's dovetailed nicely into some of the other stuff I'm reading right now.
Yeah, this was
And
new
it's been
for
good
me
to-
too. Like to take a literary approach, right? Because I think that that had never occurred to me. It's like we just want the most detail possible, which sometimes I like knowing more details. I do, but Mark does some stuff with his literary approach, doesn't he? Yeah. What else?
And that literary approach gives you a perspective of like, there's more implications when you view it from that perspective. You see those parallels better.
Paige, your screen lit up. Were you going to say something?
No, it was just my dog barking at somebody outside.
Oh.
I've been looking at the intro about Mark, and it says, so Mark's readers are called to be faithful to Jesus, even in suffering, because this is how God continues to overturn the existing order and establish the way of life that Jesus taught. I thought that was interesting.
It's our way of being the temple in the new age. Yeah.
The more I study, the more I come back to the end of the temple age, like Paige mentioned, but I also come back to he was the full fulfillment. And in so much of what I feel like I come back to for myself as the greatest commandment when he was asked, it's just love God with all your heart and love each other. It comes down to those simple. I just feel like that consistently comes back to me. And then this just helped. It just gave me more context in all of that. And it just gives it, all of these just give it to me in a deeper way. And just as, you've mentioned a few times, like seeing myself 10 years ago to myself now and how Christ has worked in my life over that time and even further back. I've always been fascinated with all of the gospels talking about the ripping of the veil and the darkness and how God just hurt. And that was the end of, and now, like, and I guess that's what this Mark has brought to me. Like, that's the end of the temple age, right? The fig tree story, this fig sandwich, you know, when you said that, and it just kind of was like, oh, yeah, it's just this very solid ending of that. And that he was just the fulfillment and 10 commandments, and he became the sacrifice, and he gave the greatest commandments. So that's just what it said to me.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to end on. This idea that, like, Jesus, every time he teaches about who he is, he points to who we should be. And even if we are, you know, trembling and bewildered, saying nothing to anyone because we are afraid, you know, how are we going to instead become the people who are not far from the kingdom of God, who love the Lord their God and who love their neighbor? As how do we get from here to there? And you know, that answer, it just like the answer of every question in the Old Testament is yes in Jesus Christ. You know, that I think that's Hebrews. The answer is Jesus, so that our discipleship, it all rests on Jesus, so that we when we are the bewildered ones, you know, we have in front of us a God who is able to change people, who's able to make people into someone who can witness for him, who can give a testimony, who can speak to truth, who can be a part of his work of building the community of faith. So I've really enjoyed studying this book. I've come to love Mark, whereas I used to think it was a little abrupt and not like not narrative enough. Like, it just didn't seem like it had enough detail. And I think it's because Mark uses the structure to tell part of the story, and I didn't know he was doing that, so I didn't know to look for it, you know. But you know, this is the second time I've taught this series of lessons, you know. This time I've just been so struck with our part in it, our faith, prayer, forgiveness, how Jesus continues to point to those things even when they completely don't get it. So as we start from wherever we are, you know, we have a way to grow into the people that God uses for his work. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop our recorder so we can do our prayer time, but I have really enjoyed this series with you. Thank you all for your great discussion.